A lot of you guys are not going to want to hear this, but I stopped being an anarchist after high school. Because the more research I did, the more I realized that the people I called tankies had been historically right about, everything. I just hadn't done enough research yet to know it. This is a quote from communist business lady Madeline Pendleton, but that's not particularly important, as I'm sure you've come across some variation of this text in your lifetime. The usual spiel about how anarchism is too childish and that you'll eventually move on and develop more materialist and dialectically sound ways of thinking. Even I, during my quite rocky political journey, went through this trend from a naive anarchist into a budding Marxist-Leninist. But, oddly enough, I would eventually come round full circle. Which might appear quite unusual, but the experience has, I would like to hope, given me a good insight into why this phenomena occurs. And so perhaps you'll allow me to voice some of my own reflections on the matter. From when I was a little boy, the perception that I had with regards to socialism or communism came from just one reference point: Joseph Stalin. If ever there were an argument to be made about the faults of the system, they could easily be passed off with the simple uttering of that 6-letter word. But after the good times have gone and capital rears its ugly head, we find ourselves unable to just sit idly by and feel compelled to solve our political economic situation. In doing so, anarchism might be that very solution of which you stumble upon. This is not an ideology of adherence to great men, but one of liberation and reciprocity. One whose very basis is within the denial of anything that could have created the clear and obvious problems of the past. It can come across as pretty inspiring. It is inevitable, however, that once you become more accustomed to the left, you may well discover that many of the things you thought about Stalin and the USSR weren't entirely accurate. It's not necessarily a glowing review, but it does allow for you to better contextualize these situations, which is often further intensified with the long legacies of previous governments and their footprints across the world. This feeling of overwhelming and crippling doubt might make us question our original choices. Perhaps we got it wrong the whole time. Perhaps all the great ideas we had were just too immaterial, too idyllic, and undialectical dreams. Perhaps, as flawed as it was, this really was the way after all. It's a sad shame that even though Stalin's ghost looms large, the dominant legacy of the left has still very much been from his hand, be that the most ardent Marxist-Leninist or your run-of-the-mill union worker. This was not the case 100 years or so ago, when the left was a lot less rigid and canonical than it has manifested as today. And during this period, anarchism in its characteristically variegated forms was the dominant element in the self-consciously internationalist radical left. That light has sadly been swept asunder. Since then, that still lingering socialist lost cause, I would argue, is one of, if not the biggest reason for what causes such an exodus of initial anarchists folding into the vanguardist path. But as you can see, that's also a highly flawed one for entry. People are becoming anarchists not because they read great things or sought great solutions as they may have done at the turn of the 20th century. They did not kill the cop in their head, but rather they became such due to the opposition towards something else. That doesn't normally create the firmest foundation. It should of course go without saying that the spread of an ideology across the world is not indicative to a tendency's correctness, and upholding the state with their classes are not going to create the conditions for a stateless, classless society. Furthermore, this whole thing screams as quite an overreaction to something that may well just need a bit of recontextualization and discussion. If only things were so simple. The Stalin Effect indeed stands as a popular route towards anarchism, and a popular reason to leave it, which might bring into question whether their basis for such adherence was a little less than desired, and what in particular might that basis be. When anarchism was gaining popularity on here around the time I was starting out, there were certain trends and mindsets which dominated discussion that in hindsight now come across as fairly flawed and detrimental. I don't want to put too much blame on anyone in particular. We were all to some extent learning on the job. But if there is one individual who can certainly be seen as the prime originator of this confusion, I can think of none other than baby's first anarchist, Leon Trotsky. Chomsky. Sorry, their names have a similar ring. Chomsky is known for popularizing the highly suspect definition of anarchism as the rejection of unjustified hierarchy. Now, this might surprise you, but whilst we see this phrase often attributed to Noam, I've been unable to find a definitive source for where this statement originates. It's likely that this has simply been the result of whispering down the lane from the actual quote by the man. In this statement, Chomsky refers to legitimate power. From a linguistic point of view, this statement carries quite a different terminology from the previous one. Power is not simply a synonym for hierarchy, but can be used to describe various different dynamics, like class power. Ultimately, though, it's clear that for whatever reason, the former interpretation won out and became the highly revered definition in public consciousness. Long-time listeners to this channel will remember that I myself used it in my very reductified History of Anarchism video from 10 years ago, which is in dire need of a remake. And even some of my wiser, more experienced friends have been using it too, which is a shame because as time has gone on, more people are understanding that this populist definition is far from desired. Firstly, and what should be pretty obvious, is that anybody can justify a hierarchy. It's all based on the grounds of perceived legitimacy. In our current world, state law enforcement is considered by the majority of people to be a justified hierarchy. People may not like it when police overstep their boundaries, but by and large, mainstream consciousness accepts the position of such actors as a thin blue line between civilization and chaos. Indeed, the whole premise of legitimacy can often be an arbitrary one. Kings and emperors throughout time have deposed their predecessors simply under the basis of perceived righteousness in the hands of the ones with the guns and/or steel. A common thought to rationalize the idea put forth by Chomsky himself is the scenario of a parent pulling a child away from a speeding vehicle. In that example, this hierarchy might be considered justified in order to prevent a worse outcome emerging. This relationship can hardly be considered on the same level as a statesman ordering decrees, or an abusive partner insisting on their way or the highway. By doing this, we're only narrowing the ways in which we can make sense of these very human dynamics. Rather, I'd argue that this example far closer resembles that of a support assistant, helping somebody to perform their tasks. You'd have to be in a very strange world to ever consider this relationship an act of subordination. It is an act of care. The words Chomsky is referring to are echoed by Mikhail Bakunin in his work, What is Authority?, in which he points to the authority of a cobbler or a doctor as a justified hierarchy. But what Bakunin calls authority here could just as easily be understood as skill expertise. We simply put our faith in them as they are more knowledgeable of certain skills and professions of which we lack. Nobody is taking our autonomy away. Bakunin was a man of his time. We shouldn't just accept the words of a 150-year-old text as our year zero, which cannot be improved upon. It might have been understandable at that point, but it's clear that since then such an understanding of authority comes across as a fair bit crude. What is authority is merely a preamble to God and the state, which itself was unfinished due to his passing. I'd also like to highlight that Mikhail's first language was Russian and God and the State was published in French. The nuance of his writing may well have gotten lost in translation. Anarchism is not against some hierarchies, it's against all forms of authority and oppression. And by making such concessions, it simply allows the playing field to be opened up to any kind of special pleading instead of encouraging one to think critically about the situation. Chomsky's own history being a running dog for the Democratic Party makes it all seem a lot clearer now. And, other things. Some still may argue that such a definition can be used to intrigue people still stuck in modernity and that afterwards they can get the full picture. If the strategy of this has so far been anything to go with, it's clear that this is not the case. You're bringing people in with a false interpretation of something only for them to find out, oh no, it's not exactly what they thought or desired. You need not be surprised when people leave. Oh, and by the way, Chomsky has never considered himself an anarchist. At best, he has defined himself as a fellow traveler. He should never have been considered such an authority on anarchism. When I stopped calling myself an anarchist, people would say, "You never were a real anarchist." Likewise, when I stopped adhering to Marxist-Leninist principles, people would tell me that you never were a real ML. Everybody, it seems, has their own excuses. Before I even came to the left, I dabbled in libertarian capitalist thought, to which after saying my farewells, I was greeted with, "You never were a real ANCAP." And all the way back when I threw away the holy orders, street preachers would claim that I had never really been a true believer. As it stands, I'm coming at this now from an anarchist perspective, so I guess I really was an anarchist the whole time, right? Or perhaps there is no fixed strata for how we come to believe something. Within any ideology, there is wiggle room and complexities to how people understand it. We are unknowingly admitting to this when we say things to the effect of "not every person in my tendency agrees with everything," when we claim that there is such constant debate. So-called anti-revisionist MLs and Maoists don't support China as a socialist project, and I'd wager good money that if people from said group were eventually to depart or defect, such beliefs could be used as a showcase that they never understood the point either. And to be honest, I'm not necessarily going to disagree there. It's all up to interpretation. And if not believing in the most dogmatic, problematic, and frankly ridiculous beliefs of any given tendency makes you not a true believer, then frankly, that's okay with me. Perhaps the issue is the ideological rigidity of fitting people into who is and who isn't. Pablo Picasso was a communist, and for the last years of his life a loyal card-carrying one. I'm sure that plenty of people might want to uphold him as a communist stamp in the same way that people might do with other supposed pinko celebrities like George Michael or Tupac Shakur. Yet his communism, as described by his dealer, also a socialist, was not a hard iron rod of loyalty, but rather a much more sentimental one. Whatever the veracity of his words, it's a rather good chance to ask some questions. As he died a nominal comrade, we can easily use him as that stamp. But if he decided to throw away those beliefs in his latter days, you could easily make the argument that he wasn't a real communist. He'd never read Marx. It is an absurd fact that lots of famous artists and intellectuals of the early 20th century were sympathetic, if not complete adherents, to socialism. But there's rarely any talk as to the why. If you ask me, it was a pre-welfare state, pre-social democratic world. Their rejection of the status quo had to be realized somewhere. Historical context is very important when analyzing someone's positions. So were all of these people socialists? I'll let you decide for yourself. One of the great beauties of anarchism is its fluidity in this regard. It is a process of undoing authoritative structures, not a specific adherence to one person's particular thought that must be vigor-tested. Anarchist ethics are ones that embrace flexibility, uncertainty, and are always redefining what it really means to be an anarchist. Resisting the status quo, embracing this ambiguity rather than trying to pin down anarchism as a specific ideology or political project. It doesn't mean that anything goes, but that we as a collective decide what goes here and now, and not that it is universal. Boots Riley, who is himself Marxist-Leninist aligned, once claimed that it is largely due to the effects of anti-communism for the emergence of many anarchist tendencies. Anti-communism is certainly playing a role, but forgive me for critiquing popular African-American communists, but within this narrative, Riley is showcasing some ignorance. As we've gone over, anarchist ideas, theorists, and movements have all been widespread regardless of any Red Scare being present. And ironically, whilst highlighting reactionary narratives, you might have overlooked that this same argument can also be applied to anarchism. Arguably, even more so. In the words of Joyce Messier.
Oh, and the anarchists too. They shot them well. So well, one forgets they even existed.
What is the general view of anarchism in the mainstream? Bunch of idealist, middle-class edgelords who live off their parents and just want to watch the world burn. They don't have theory. They don't understand economics. They just want to piss on the floor and smoke weed. If you want to claim that communism had a hack job made about it, anarchism had the nail in the coffin. Communist ideals still have a degree of mainstream prominence. This is particularly evident in the academy. Anarchist history, by comparison, has until relatively recently just been thrown into the pool of irrelevance by wider society. How much might people know about the McCarthyist witch hunts of the 1950s, compared with the much more violent first Red Scare and its aftermath, of which, due to their prominence at the time, anarchists were some of the most targeted actors? Even within anarchist spheres themselves, long-forgotten figures and narrative-altering stories suddenly emerge and illuminate as if out of the thin air, like Yi Hui-yong, a moneyed Korean man who, after defecting to anarchism, used his entire fortune towards fighting the imperialist Japanese. On that topic, we can talk of Kotoku Shusui, who wrote an entire thesis on the understanding of imperialism 15 years before Lenin. Or probably my favorite example of all, that of Sholem Schwarzbart, a Jewish anarchist who lost nearly his entire family in the Russian Civil War due to pogroms, and gained his retribution in 1926 by shooting and killing the General Petlura, responsible for half the pogrom deaths during the war. After his trial, he was decided not guilty, and Petlura's family were forced to pay for his legal costs. There is also the possibility that after becoming disillusioned from the Red Army, he fought alongside Makhno, and would later associate with various comrades of history in Paris. And yet, while I was doing a bit of my usual cruising around the blogosphere, I came across this. Sholem is now only a Red Army veteran, despite it being a relatively minor part of his life. Suffice to say, there has been an observed trend of anarchists being conveniently written out of the history books, and contemporary socialists, whether knowingly or unknowingly, have always tended to find ways as to not bring up their importance.
Do you have an alternative? What's your alternative? Are you an anarchist? Is that what your alternative is? Like, this notion is hilarious. People with my mindset and the mindset of many others in this community have fought long and hard for a lot of the amenities. That you don't like child labor. Child labor is hyper exploitative. It's ridiculous. Well, thank a fucking union for that. Thank the communists for that, for fighting long and hard through literal labor militancy, through battles with blood, sweat, and tears. You like the weekend? Thank a union for that. Thank some communists for that, okay?
The Haymarket affair occurred during a strike for the 8-hour day. During a demonstration organized by the anarchist org, the International Working People's Association, a bomb was thrown into the square, which subsequently led to 4 anarchists facing the noose after being falsely accused of conspiracy. The subsequent cause célèbre created during their trial and gruesome deaths gave birth to the historic International Workers' Day, the unofficial holiday of socialists and workers across the globe. But now let's see Jyoti Brar of CBGBML describing the event from her perspective.
On the way here today, my daughter was asking me, why is today Workers' Day? Why are we going? Why are we wearing red? What is this all about, Mum? And I said to her, well, there's a historical reason, which is that in the 1880s they conducted a militant strike for better pay and conditions and were attacked. They were massacred by the US police, and then their leaders were hanged, ironically, as murderers.
So, just strike leaders in a vaguely alluded to socialist movement so that they can be reclaimed as their martyrs. No mention of their anarchism, because to do so would mean Jyoti might need to answer a few more of her kids' questions. I'm not bringing this up to be petty. I could just as easily point to the wide range of figures whose more radical political nature is often hidden by mainstream society and the socialists' efforts to reclaim and repudiate their stances. In the same way, anarchists are not just going to sit down and watch people butcher and redwash their legacy. Those narratives are important too. They are not just a footnote in history. It is largely due to anti-anarchism and Soviet hegemony, which explains the rise of pro-communist alignment in the West. It's ironic because, arguably, Boots is very much the ideal candidate with which to talk about this.
I mean, it must be very interesting for you as a well-known anti-capitalist artist and organizer to
Communist.
Before I came to the left, I asked anarchists, if cooperative businesses are so much better, why are they not everywhere? And obviously there's a plethora of reasons as to why, but the overarching one is quite simply that we live in an society which incentivizes verticality, as opposed to decentralization. Schools of the Leninist and social democratic vein are still very much applicable towards this format, anarchism not so much. It's a school very much alien to mainstream opinion. It's interesting to note this for Leninism especially, because whilst appearing very radical on the surface, dig a little deeper and you'll notice that there's an enormous amount of pining for general common sense. It never stops amusing me seeing Leninists upholding the regimented Prussian-inspired school system as essential and in line with communist ethics. One might wonder what happened to the ruthless critique of compulsory education. Prisons will still exist, but they'll just be the good prisons, which will only ever throw away fascists, and certainly never just put people in because of general grievances directed towards the powers that be. How could they? The power is in the hands of the workers now. And too often the description of a workers' state seems almost parallel with that of a capitalist one, where workers will attend socialist workplaces to earn socialist wages in order to buy socialist commodities, all whilst being protected by the socialist police. Say what you want about that, but there's very little radical here. The status quo is simply shifting, not being ruptured from. This makes it far more palatable to a liberal palate. And I bring this up because when I look back to the anarchism of my youth, I'm 31, I do seem to remember how my mindset was still wrestling with the ruptures which anarchism took even from conventional socialist practice. It was always difficult to understand the culture of it all. Things appeared so disorderly. You never got the full information upon new projects being created. There was never a direct push for recruitment, etc. Only in hindsight now does it all suddenly seem to make sense the way that things were. The disorderly appearance might be explained by the desire to work at our own speed and comfort, to reduce burnout by working within our means. The lack of full disclosure on projects is simply an outgrowth of the practice of security culture. And when you do things right, you'll never have to meet a new recruit ever again. Because they're your comrades, not just numbers on a spreadsheet, cogs in a machine, wages for some old man. I was a newly minted anarchist when my nephew was born, and I thought maybe I should get him a book to introduce him to anarchist ideas. A Rule is to Break seemed promising and was widely recommended to me. However, looking into it a bit more, I felt like it might give him the wrong idea. Sure, Ask Why might be a good idea in abstract between intelligent and informed adults, but a child might interpret that as Ask Why to literally anything, even the most minuscule of concepts, I think. And I can't put that stress upon my sister. Today, I wouldn't have thought twice about getting him that book. Of course, I probably wouldn't on account of that I don't really feel comfortable forcing blatant politics down my family's throat anymore, but I think it's a good showcase of where my mindset was. The first was being helicoptery and neurotic, considering me and my journey, whatever problems I went through, fine, but that everybody now needs to adhere to my workflow. The latter is granting agency, valuing someone's autonomy and growth over what are, for the most part, mild difficulties. Looking back at my life, that is the very sort of advice that I wish I'd been given. It would have helped me become a much more assertive person far earlier in my life. There may well be a lot of anarchists who still haven't fully embraced that mindset, and instead hinge their beliefs on pragmatism and efficiency. Which brings us to what is surely one of the most pervasive reasons for throwing in the black towel. I think it's fair to say that every anarchist will at some point face the dreaded question of, how will it be done? Slavoj Žižek once said something to the effect of, "How do you get water?" A very pervasive one I've seen is, "How will you defend against counter-revolution?" Others I've come across, "How will you get scarce resources? How will you make glasses?" Quite an interesting one is, "How will you create insulin?" Because DIY insulin is very much a real existing thing, and biohackers have been at it for a long time. Certainly there is reason to be concerned with all of these arrangements coming from the outside, but when it comes to whether the crux of an ideology is valid, whether you choose such a process to go with, I find there's always a mistake being made here. These questions all seem to belong within the area of what I like to call the how-what dimension. They look at things in a very pragmatic way, which is again backed up primarily by the status quo they're accustomed to. And when things don't apply to their current understandings of how society appears to work, they will say, "That's stupid, grow up." But when we get down to it, do our politics really begin at the level of pragmatism and strategy? Or is there something deeper? Perhaps the values, the why of what we believe. The fundamental anarchist critique of state power as a strategy is not driven by a moralist imperative, states are bad, but rather that such a method will never lead to the ends which you desire. That's because at the core of this apparatus lies a conflict between those whose interests are towards the state and those whose interests are constricted by them. Just like the conflict of interest driven between those with capital versus those without, there is virtually zero possibility of those in power voluntarily rejecting their interests. The state is a hierarchical institution, and thus it will develop ways to self-sustain such hierarchy. Changing conditions do not suddenly change the primary function of such an institution. That's where the basis of the critique comes from. And by doing this, we get past the banal and tired questions of who will build the roads, and instead discuss the core principles of an ideology. Now the onus is upon the questioners themselves to first answer the question of state legitimacy and authority, to which the answers you'll find tend to be an appeal towards human nature, or a completely different and frankly flawed interpretation of what the state represents, insisting that state formation will always occur as it is simply a representation of whose will is in force. People are always so insistent upon the how of a given system, yet never seem to grasp the fundamental whys of what they believe and how it will affect people. It's by no means an all-proof comparison, but I found the contrast with veganism to be a helpful one for understanding this. Vegans, as I'm sure you're all aware, have an enormous overabundance of silly arguments for why their system can't work. What about this? What about that? And obviously some more pragmatic and compelling than others. But the point of veganism doesn't start with a checkpoint solution for how every matter will be solved. It starts with a principle. That we should avoid the consumption of animals and their products as much as possible. If you take that on board, you will quickly notice how all of those arguments become not necessarily things to ignore, but not anything that would destroy the integrity of your beliefs. Because you're no longer balancing them on the what, you're balancing them on the why. From there, you will get your answers following the framework you've decided upon. The same is very much true for anarchism. People might question the pragmatics of large-scale agriculture under a system of delineated power. In doing so, they're only presupposing the way that we do things now. Anarchist values, on the other hand, heavily point towards permaculture, the art of creating long-lasting sources of food which require little handiwork, all whilst having shown great potential to be as efficient as other methods. This method favors a delineation of power, with reduced working hours and granting immediate access to the surrounding people. Some might argue that these are the ideals which go hand in hand with a system that many of us aspire to. Political anarchism did not exist transhistorically. It evolved in modern times through theory and practice based on their understanding of social relations. The historic anarchists of all stripes came up with their praxis by working through the framework they decided upon. A framework of eliminating and combating all forms of authority wherever they see them. And if we agree with the central premise that authority is not self-justifying and will only further solidify its power, you can't then take up the idea of, well, a little bit of hierarchy for the meantime, because it stands in complete contradiction with your principle. Not a tendency then, but an ongoing process of experimentation which has no end. It's fair to say that I've gone through quite a few political transformations over the years. To some it's become a bit of a meme, even Urban Dictionary has some words to say about it. And to others it might well be reason enough to dismiss my points out of hand as a spineless ideology shopper. I can't change the past, but if I had anything to say about it, it would simply be the unfortunate truth that I was young. And when you're young and inexperienced, you tend to make rather silly decisions under the impression that you're older and more mature than you really are. My story is far from unique, and anybody who says otherwise is talking shit. The way of thinking that helped me rekindle those anarchic beliefs as I got older was again not on the what, but on the why. And if I believe this, how can I justify X to achieve Y? Eventually I realized that I could not balance the aims of the internationalist socialist ideals with the strategy put forward by Marxist-Leninists, and that's something that I have yet to hear a good answer to. It's not a requirement for every anarchist to know every who, what, and how things will be done, but it is enough for us to balance our methods with our conclusions. Looking at this then in retrospect, Pendleton's sentiment ironically comes across as the actual juvenile projection, filled with an inflated ego reminiscent of an arrogant, self-important stylist mentality. To paraphrase from one subcomandante Marcos, whoever has stopped with the thought that their truth should be the truth for everybody and forever will sooner or later dedicate their force not so that their truth will be born, grow, be fruitful, and die, but rather use it to kill everything that doesn't agree with this truth.